hopefully you should see a nice big white screen with chapter 2 on it. So last week I established a little bit of a structure for how we're going to go through each chapter in Mark's Gospel. And yes, I am. Sorry, I am unmuted there. That's fine. So the structure I'm going through, we went through this last week, but just to remind you, I'm going to talk about how this chapter fits within the gospel as a whole. And then I'm going to move on and talk about 3 topics that I aim to repeat each week. The top theme for this week, then my little topic called Style Matters, where I'll talk about a feature of Mark's literary or rhetorical style that helps us get an insight into what's going on in the gospel. Then another awful pun, I'm afraid, mark his words. So I'm just going to pick on one word that appears in chapter 2 and focus on that in a little detail. I'll bring out the Greek word as well for you, just so you're aware of that. And then some other stuff, and there's quite a bit of stuff to fit in, so I'll move on as rapidly as I can. There's a section when I sent out the material earlier today. You will notice there's a section called "In case they come up in the Q&A," and I know that certainly in my own group a couple of topics came up, but I'm not going to go through those until we get to the Q&A, and we'll see whether they are the topics that we want to deal with or those other things that we want to talk about. So anyway, that's just to give you a feel for what we're talking about. So let's remind ourselves of the structure of the gospel. You might remember this table now from week 1 and week 2. So this is the structure of Mark's gospel, 3 big sections. First one in Galilee, which is really the first 8.5 chapters. Then Jesus moves on his way to Jerusalem. And then finally in chapter 11, he gets to Jerusalem, and then we have his passion, his trial, passion, and death. And of course, the empty tomb in chapter 16. So that's the overall structure of the gospel. And within that, we're obviously still in this first section of Galilee, where Jesus is continuing to do his deeds of power. But perhaps where those deeds of power were just gratefully accepted in chapter 1, we're now seeing a little bit of pushback, aren't we? So it was all success in chapter 1, but now the mood in chapter 2 is a little bit different. We're having growing opposition, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. So chapter 2 really is 4 of a series of 5 what are called controversy stories, because they've all got a little bit of an argument or controversy going on within them. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. So those stories, as you know yourself, because we've discussed them, 4 big stories really in this chapter. Jesus healing the paralytic. Then he calls Levi and is eating with tax collectors and sinners, and the scribes don't like that at all. And then the Pharisees make a challenge about the behavior of Jesus's disciples, specifically about them not fasting. And then finally in this chapter, there's also a challenge about Jesus's disciples plucking grain, doing work on the Sabbath. So 4 of those 5 controversy stories in chapter 2. It actually extends into chapter 3. So those of you who did read ahead for the first 6 verses that I alerted you to, we'll obviously go through that in a bit more detail next week, but at least you will have hopefully seen how that part is really part of it goes with chapter 2. It's a bit unfortunate really that the chapter divided at verse 1 of chapter 3, but that's a whole other matter, which you might want to ask me about in the Q&A. So that's how we've fitted. It's all about the deeds of power, but we're really moving from, just success to that bit of pushback and controversy. Now, this week's top theme I've decided to take on, because there was quite a lot of discussion about this, particularly in week 1, but also to a degree in week 2, just to talk a bit more about the Son of Man, because obviously that's a really key title in Mark's Gospel. So just to remind you of what we talked about in session 1, we've got all these various titles, haven't we? In verse 1, we've got Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So we've got 3 titles there straight away. And later in the Gospel, in chapter 10, Jesus is called Son of David. And in chapter 15, several times he's called the King of the Jews. But I don't really want to focus on any of those for now. That's just a bit of context. The one I really want to focus on is the one that was in the middle of the diagram, which is the Son of Man. So we see the first of 15 occurrences of that phrase in Mark's Gospel actually occurs in verse 10, And then we hear a second occurrence of it in verse 28. So the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, and the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. We hear both in chapter 2. All the other occurrences of the Son of Man are actually in the second half of the gospel. So in one sense, I ideally would have postponed this until about chapter 8 or 9. But because I think we've been talking about it already, I thought we'd just kind of get a little bit of context early here in chapter 2. So nearly all of those 15 occurrences of Son of Man are actually by Jesus referring to himself. And he actually uses it very frequently in response to somebody else when they've called him one of these other titles. So Peter says, "You are the Christ," for example. And Jesus says, "The Son of Man will suffer." When the chief priest asks Jesus directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus answers it by, "The Son of Man, you will see the Son of Man coming in glory." So even though other people want to pin these other titles on Jesus, Jesus really wants to be the Son of Man. Now, if we look back at the Son of Man, it was a phrase that had a fair bit of resonance in the Hebrew Scriptures. Again, I'm not expecting you to take in the detail of this chart on the right-hand side, but you can see that there's quite a lot of occurrences of Son of Man in quite a lot of different books of the Bible. And particularly in the Old Testament, you can see all these occurrences here. You might know that actually Son of Man in Hebrew is Ben Adam. Now, Ben is son of, and Adam, which is like Adam, is man, a human being. So Ben Adam actually occurs quite a few times in the Scriptures just as an expression for a human being. It's often used as a contrast to what God's like. So we see a lot of parallelism in the Psalms. God is like this, but the man, Son of Man, if you like, is like this. So one level of meaning of the Son of Man is just human being. And some scholars just see Jesus as Son of Man as simply a reference to the human one, if you like, might be another title. But actually, that sets aside, I think, two other big contexts of the use of Son of Man in the Old Testament. One is as a prophetic saying. So you can see this big bar here is the prophet Ezekiel. And 93 times he's told by God, "Son of Man, say this to the people of Israel." So God is, if you like, there, God is definitely insisting on the humanity of the prophet, but he's also giving the prophet a special job to do. It's not just any Son of Man's job, but it's a prophetic job. So when we hear Son of Man, we need to hear prophet or prophetic. But there's also a very small number of occurrences here in the book of Daniel. But in chapter 7 specifically, a really important set of references to a figure. Eschatological, by the way, is a posh word for the end times. What's going to happen at the end of time? And so we have a kind of passage there in Daniel 7, which is a figure like a Son of Man. So he's otherwise appears to be, if you like, in the supernatural world, but he appears like a Son of Man. In other words, like a human being. Jesus frequently uses references in Mark that relate to this Daniel type figure. But we'll see more of that as we get into the second half of the gospel. So it's actually used quite widely across the gospels as well. As you can see, these blue bars here are the various four gospel writers, right across all four, in fact. And there are actually only a few other uses in the New Testament, a couple of which are in the book of Revelation, which is directly quoting those kind of Daniel type references. So a broad use of it, but prophetic and this eschatological end times figure who is, if you like, bringing the power of God and the will of God to the world. Jesus tends to use the term in three ways. In chapter 2, he's really using it as what the Son of Man is doing right now. So the Son of Man has authority over sins, and the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he's a prophetic figure, but he's expressing that prophetic identity in the here and now of Mark's gospel. When he gets onto the second half, we'll see a lot more about his immediate destiny as the one who will suffer. And we see that particularly from chapter 8 onwards. And then the later on we go, we see an even greater emphasis on this figure who will come in glory. And we see the height of that in chapter 14. So there's three uses of the term, and they become, if you like, increasingly eschatological, I guess, increasingly in what the Son of Man will be for the destiny of the whole world, that kind of end time figure. But it's a bit human and it's a bit supernatural, a bit of both. And perhaps that's deliberate by Jesus. He's perhaps using a little bit of deliberate ambiguity about the nuances of that term, which are maybe that ambiguity is a bit like the way he uses parables. You have to work it out for yourself and decide what that really means. Because alongside all of this, of course, is Jesus' use of the Son of Man, is this constant background of Mark and other characters calling him the Son of God, Son of Man, Son of God, Jesus, divine and human. And that's a neat way in which the two actually come together. So anyway, just a rapid look at the Son of Man. We will look at that more as we come later in the when we come to about the 8th chapter onwards in Mark's Gospel. We'll talk about the Son of Man a lot more. But let's talk about the little item in Style Matters this week. You might remember this picture from session 1, this string of pearls. That's a term that's been used by some scholars for the way that Mark arranges the episodes in his gospel. We talk quite a lot about this in our discussion group. I think the point I want to make is that we don't want to get too hung up on what the chronology is here, what the timing is, because I don't think that's really Mark's interest. The episodes are really arranged topically rather than chronologically. So we don't know exactly where these particular episodes occurred in Jesus's ministry, and that's not really the focus. We've actually got a set of very similar episodes happening together, and that's really what Mark's about. He's stringing those pearls of a similar type together to make a particular point. So actually, the reason this is not about the reason I say this is not about chronology is that the time frames are almost deliberately vague. After some days, again, and one Sabbath. So if you go back and look at the way each of those instances are introduced, they're the time frames that we get. Very vague, not really trying to locate them in the first year of the ministry or whatever, really more about what they've got in common in topical terms. Now, there is actually, and this is what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, there is actually a really quite sophisticated pattern going on in chapter 2, which runs into the first part of chapter 6. It is, as I say, unfortunate, the medieval chapter divisions. This is one that's particularly unfortunate because we really should regard 3:1 to 3:6 as part of this sequence. But let me show you how. So we've actually got two structures, and forgive me for a second, I'm just going to be a little bit technical and literary, but I think you will hopefully see what I'm trying to say. So there's one structure is a concentric structure where we've got a series of episodes all focused on a common center. And the posh word, which I'll use in a second, is chiasm or chiasm. But there's also, along with that concentric structure, there's actually a linear structure going on at the same time. Easier to show it than to put words to it. So let's talk about chiasm or chiasm. Well, this actually comes from the Greek letter chi, which is shaped like an X, but it's not an X, it's a he sound in Greek. If you're a mathematician, you'll probably call this chi or chi or whatever. And so often this word is pronounced chiasm by many people. What it actually is a symmetrical pattern within either a body of text, either a narrative, a whole section, or a particular phrase. Let me just illustrate what I mean. So we've got like an ABBA, not the Swedish pop group, but an ABBBA structure. So here you get an idea that's A, and you get another idea that's A at the end. You get one at the start and one at the end. And in between those, you get a B here at the top, and you get another B in the middle. So the way the sequence of this goes is you start with A, and you read on, you go to B, you read on, you get to the other B, and then you come back to an A idea. So that's why it tries to represent it as if it were an X-type structure. But really what you've got is an idea at the start and the end, and two other similar ideas in the middle. The whole point about it is A and A have something in common and B have something in common. And sometimes you get an even more clever structure with A, B, C, B, A, where there's a different idea in the middle. And that's that concentric idea you can see. These are on the outside, these are on the outside, these are in a little bit further in, and that's right at the center. Now, these structures, you think nobody does that. Well, they do actually, quite a lot. It's extremely common in the Hebrew scriptures, and it's also quite common in Greco-Roman literature. So anybody who studied Tacitus or Cicero or anything like that, or if you've looked at Homer or some of the Greek poets, these are really common patterns, believe me. And it's a rhetorical device that we still see in modern times. Here's John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country, A, can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. So the red here are the outside ideas and the orange are the middle ideas. Your country can do for you what you can do for your country. There's also one in Mark 2:27. The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. Sabbath, Sabbath, humankind, humankind. So there's quite a lot of these go on, and you see them quite commonly in these kind of catchphrases that Jesus uses. Now, that's to prepare you for what is really quite an amazing structure of the whole of this section. It's actually a chiasm. So it starts with this healing, and I've bolded the key words here. It started with a healing of a paralytic and talking about forgiveness. But then it talks about Levi eating with sinners. Sinners. You see how that pattern is also there as well? And then in the center, and I think in our group, somebody pointed this out, right at the center of this is the old and new. And in fact, this is what one of our groups were feeding back as well, wasn't it? So you've got healing, eating, fasting, which is not eating. See the way that's linked? And then it goes back to another passage about eating grain on the Sabbath. And then there's another passage about healing on the Sabbath. So there's a really quite sophisticated way in which these passages are knitted together. Now you say, no, Deacon Martin, you're making all that up. That's just you being kind of trying to find something clever. Well, I think I'm not alone here. Most scholars can see this pattern. Why is he doing it? Is he just doing it to be clever in the hope that people 2,000 years later will still be talking about this fantastic pattern? No, I don't think it's for cleverness. I think it's because Mark wants you to see the patterns. Because remember, in an oral culture, people would have remembered, right, what was the next story? Okay, there's 5 stories, aren't there? And how are they connected? Well, one's about healing. Oh, there's another one about healing. And there's one about eating. Oh, there's another one about eating. And oh, there's one about fasting as well. And so that helps us understand the structure, but it also helps us understand how these stories are related. So it's a really quite sophisticated pattern. You just need to take a step back to look at it. And it won't be the only one in Mark's gospel, by the way. But it's really not about cleverness. It's about helping you remember, because this is all about the message, remember. It's not about, Mark's not trying to win the Booker Prize. He's trying to get you to accept that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So that's why he's doing it. Now, on top of that chiastic, concentric pattern, there's also a linear pattern. So here's the same 5 episodes, including that bit of chapter 3, actually arranged as a sequence. Here we've got the healing, the paralytic, etc., in a sequence. Now, why have I arranged them this way? Because at the same time these are going on in sequence, there's a growing set of forces of opposition, and there's also a growing intensity of opposition. Let me show you what I mean. So in the first story, the healing of the paralytic, the opposition is just scribes. We go to the next story, and it's the scribes of the Pharisees. So we've got this element of some particular scribes who are associated with the Pharisees. The next story, and then the plucking grain on the Sabbath, the Pharisees begin to get involved. So we've gone from scribes to Pharisees, and then I know many of you won't have looked at this in detail. In chapter 3, we even get the Herodians involved. So it's not just about one group. There's a kind of mounting opposition, a set of groups who are all opposed to Jesus. Same thing, by the way, on this right-hand side with the intensity of the opposition. In the first story, there's just a bit of silent questioning, a bit of grumbling, but only Jesus knows it's going on. In the second one, the scribes of the Pharisees are sufficiently bold that they go to the disciples and say, "Oi, why does Jesus do that?" But it gets bolder still, because in the next story, they ask Jesus about what his disciples are doing. And so that when they then finally come to the final question, and this opposition is growing and growing, they're actually not questioning anymore. They're looking for legal pretexts to condemn Jesus. And of course, they are, and again, I'm giving away part of chapter 3 here, I know, they will plot his murder, which we'll see a bit more of when we look at that section next week. So along with that kind of concentric structure, you have this linear structure getting more forces of opposition and more intense, the opposition becoming more intense and more active, if you like, in the way that it's being expressed. Okay, so that was just a little bit about Mark and style. Really very clever. Mark's not too clever with individual words, maybe, but he's very good, I think, at assembling his narrative blocks in patterns. And remember, we talked about patterns a lot in session 1. These patterns are the sort of thing that are helping you really get a grip of the story. Let's look at a word, though. This word is faith. The Greek word is pistis. It's really key, isn't it, to receiving the benefits of Jesus' healing. It's not a qualification for getting healing. As somebody pointed out, the paralytic didn't ask to be healed, but he got it all the same because his friends had great faith. And it appears in many of the healing narratives in a positive way, mostly, as we saw today, the men carrying the paralytic, the woman who had a bleeding, which we'll see when we come to chapter 5, and our friend Bartimaeus, who called out to Jesus and had great faith. But there are also negative sides. So there is, as well as great faith, there is great unbelief. And we see that so much in Nazareth in chapter 6, that Jesus could produce no miracles there. Jesus is constantly challenging not just his disciples to have faith, which he does in chapter 4 when he walks across the water, but also, when he calms the storm, and he can also challenge people who are looking for Jesus to do something. And he says, all things can be done for the one who believes. So I'm not just talking about the faith word here as a noun, but also the verb to believe, which is pisteo in Greek. But so it's the same word underneath. So that's faith. It's really important that people have faith to take on what Jesus is offering. But let's go back to that wonderful scene of the healing of the paralytic. This picture here from Ravenna is a beautiful mosaic. Of those of you who had the chance to go to Ravenna and see it, God willing, there will be a time when we can all get out and do this again at some point. This is Father Mark in our parish priest. This is his favorite story, and this is the picture that he's used to communicate his vision for our parish, that we would be people who are mat carriers, people who want to take other people and bring them to Jesus. And so the mat carriers in this case, they're willing to break the boundaries, aren't they? I think it's absolutely wonderful. In the Greek, by the way, it says they unroofed the roof. Beautiful kind of little bit of redundancy in the way that Mark says it, but they really, really kind of made an effort and they dug through that roof. They showed a degree of ingenuity because they were blocked, but that wasn't going to stop them. And they were persistent in getting their goal of getting their friend to Jesus. And many of you will know that Pope Francis is quite keen on this idea. They made a bit of a mess, didn't they? Just imagine all that plaster or whatever it was in the roof that they dug through, and it was all falling down on the heads, perhaps on the heads of the people in the posh seats, like the scribes maybe, who are sitting there. Maybe they've got to the posh seats. In fact, Jesus says later in Mark's gospel that the scribes like to take the most important seats. So maybe they were sitting there at the front, and then they felt all this stuff going on their heads and wondered what was going on. So these men with the paralytic, not afraid to make a bit of a mess. So the question for us is, how much does our faith lead to action? So our action really ideally should show the faith we have, not just that we're just like any other people who are showing altruism, but that our action comes from faith in Jesus, and that we are seeking to be his instruments in this world. But also a faith without action, I think Mark is suggesting, is perhaps a faith that hasn't really fully translated. Okay, so I've talked about the structure of the gospel. I've talked the structure of how the way this chapter fits in the gospel. We've talked about the wonderful aspect of Mark's style in the way that he constructs his pearls and strings his pearls on the string. And we've talked about faith and its importance. Let's quickly go through some other ideas. Tax collectors, this wonderful picture from the Netherlandish painter Quentin Massys, these kind of grasping guys. Tax collection in Galilee, Capernaum would have been a real key point for tax collection. The Greek word there is telonion. It comes from the Greek word telos, which amongst other things is what is due. I've written, again, shameless self-promotion, so apologies for that. I've written a Bible word blog on the word telos, so that you can have a look at that in a bit more detail offline if you wish. But the reason that Capernaum was an important tax collection point is that there was a route that went up from the Damascus in the northeast, if you like, right through to Caesarea Maritima, which was on the Mediterranean coast. And if you draw that line directly, it actually cuts across the top northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, which is pretty much exactly where Capernaum is. So Capernaum is right on this thing called the Via Maris. As you know, the Romans liked their roads to be straight, and this one ran straight from Damascus to Caesarea Maritima, but it went through Capernaum. So what were taxes for? Well, actually, in this case, probably most of the taxes were for Herod Antipas, the puppet ruler of Galilee, but they also would have had to pay a temple tax. So it's not so much Roman tax, really more about royal taxes for the local ruler. But the taxes probably would have been collected by a tax collector. Was probably a telonios was probably a local functionary employee. He wasn't Mr. Big. He was probably doing the legwork, if you like, on behalf of a royal office holder. Those of you who remember the old-fashioned translation of publican, that's probably an anachronism, because Julius Caesar had banned it probably pretty much 40 years before Christ. So tax collector is really a local. The point is, it's a Jew, and that they didn't like the idea of Jews doing this kind of dirty work. So they weren't well regarded. In fact, they weren't well regarded anywhere, either by the Romans or the Hellenistic culture, or very much so in the Jewish culture. So think about this. Levi is one of the people called by Jesus, and he's been called alongside the fishermen, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, who were probably having to pay their taxes through Levi. So they probably didn't like Levi very much. So there was probably a fascinating group dynamic going on amongst Jesus's disciples there. But tax collectors and sinners, somebody was alluding to that they are equated together. You might as well be a sinner as a tax collector. But when Levi was called, it's really interesting. His call was really irrevocable. There was no way back for him. The fishermen, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, they could go back to fishing. And indeed, we see, particularly in John's gospel, that they did indeed go back to doing that at first. But Levi would have found that as soon as he left his job, there was plenty of people who wanted it instead. And so there would have been plenty of takers for his job, because it was really quite a lucrative job. But here's something that I think is really key. Tax collectors and sinners are gathered together, but Jesus gathers them into fellowship before they repent. And I pointed out to my group that Luke's parallel of this particular passage of the tax collectors and sinners, Luke says, feels the need to add to repentance. But there's no actual repentance going on explicitly in the Markan scene. In fact, those of you who know of this model about belong, believe, behave, so the idea is maybe in this day and age, you need to have a sense of belonging before you can really have a proper sense of believing. And then ultimately that will translate into the way that you behave. So in other words, we can't just give people the rules and expect them in this day and age necessarily to follow them, because if they feel detached, they won't feel any reason to belong. Jesus clearly was a big believer in that model. He wanted people to belong first, and then he fully expected that they would believe And that was why faith's important. And then they would behave and repent accordingly. I guess the key question for us is, we've got tax collectors and sinners in our society, and maybe even in our church community. Do we set preconditions on others coming to Jesus, both individually and perhaps as the institutional church? Do we put barriers in the way of Jesus's mercy? Let's talk a little bit about repetition. Here's another very interesting thing. We talked about repetition very briefly in session 1. There's a threefold repetition that goes on in chapter 2. In the middle of this scene about Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, you might have noticed that phrase is repeated 3 times in just 3 verses. I'd say, and I appreciate that this metaphor, by the way, is anachronistic. Mark isn't a 21st century film director. I fully understand that. But it's quite a nice analogy for us to see how this works. So here's Jesus with the tax collectors and sinners, and he's reclining with them. And that's what Mark says. There were tax collectors and sinners, and they were reclining with Jesus. Mark tells us that. We can see the scene. But then the scene pans out a little bit, if you like, and the camera pulls back. And we see at the edge of this, there's a couple of scribes, there's some scribes there. And this scribe's not very happy about it at all. He's looking at what's going on and thinking, Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. And it goes still further, of course, that he hauls one of the disciples in and says, why is Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners? So we're seeing this broadening of perspective. Mark tells us what's going on, but then we see it through the eyes of the scribes, and eventually the scribes then bring it to the attention of the disciples. Really quite a clever piece of narration. Why does he do that? Well, I think there's an emphasis, isn't there, on Jesus's action. Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. You can't avoid that. And it does increase the sense of scandal, because you not only hear it, but you hear somebody else's reaction to it and the fact that they're not very happy. And then, of course, the question increases this sense of the conflict that's going on. This also happens in another place in chapter 2. Have a look at verses 6 to 8 in your own time, and have a look about how this threefold repetition of questioning within themselves actually does a similar idea. Not exactly the same, but a similar principle. So that's repetition. Let's talk about this idea. I didn't hear about this anywhere. We didn't, I think, particularly talk about this within the group. But the little hint of the bridegroom being taken away in verse 20. So it says, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. So that's the first allusion to the passion and to the shadow of the cross that we talked about again in session 1. So the days will come is a kind of prophetic statement. The days will come. You might have heard that in the prophets in the Old Testament. So there's a significant event ahead. And that verb taken away is actually in the Greek the same verb that's used in Isaiah chapter 53, which is that section of the suffering servant that we'll hear on Good Friday. His judgment was taken away and his life was taken from the earth. So it's the same Greek verb there. And this is actually a chiasm. The days will come on that day, the bridegroom is taken away, and they will fast. So we see that fasting comes when the bridegroom is taken away. The days are now when the bridegroom's here. We don't do fasting, but on that day, we will do the fasting. One little bit of mark and detail. Don't worry about what's on screen here in detail. Not expecting you to read it. This is a similar pattern that's something that I showed in section 1, but I'm actually applying it to the healing of the paralytic here in chapter 2. Same conclusion. Mark's account here in the middle is longer than the other two. You can see that really, can't you? It occupies more text. There's a bit of space there, and there's lots of space here. And Mark has lots of detail. The blue that's not actually included at all in Matthew and Luke. See how much there is? And the yellow where it's actually shortened. And all of this is some of the kind of exciting and vivid stuff about the crowding and the speaking the word and that digging through the roof. That's all there. And the scribes as well sitting there. Luke actually, by the way, adds detail of his own. But I also wanted to draw your attention to this wonderful thing. Can you see that this is almost white? There's no color here. The core account of Jesus saying to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, stand up and walk, get on with it, is almost exactly the same in the three synoptics. which indicates that this is a tradition that goes back, I believe, a long way, and is really therefore very likely to be very authentic to the actual mission of Jesus. So finally, a question for us to reflect on: would we be any different from these religious people? You see, I think the religious people get a bit of a hard rap here. I think they're doing their best. They had strong values and they didn't want Jesus undermining them. They were faithful people and they were worried that this guy was going against the tradition. How could that be good when we've been doing this for so long? This must be God's will. They perhaps thought that he was an imposter and was misleading the people and driving them away. So before we get smug about those Pharisees who never got it, let's maybe think that there's a Pharisee somewhere in me. And are we actually very wedded to our old wine? And what are we going to do when we get the new wine of the kingdom of God? Are we going to ignore it because it doesn't fit? Or are we going to find some new wineskins and start using it? So that's enough of me. Loads of other things I could have talked about, and including some other things. These are crossed out because they're a hint that I'm going to talk about them a bit more in subsequent weeks. But I think that's quite enough for me for now. I know I have overrun a little bit. Many apologies, but there you go. Let's have some Q&A.